Imagine that, as you close your eyes, you enter a vast landscape where the boundaries between the visible and the invisible blur, and the doors of perception open to a world of hidden wisdom. In The Stages of Higher Knowledge by Rudolf Steiner, you will be guided along a mysterious path toward knowledge beyond the limits of ordinary thought. Steiner, with his profound vision and unique approach, invites us on a journey into the realms of the soul and spirit, where science and spirituality meet. Each stage you will explore is like a step toward a higher understanding, an ascent toward an insight that transcends conventional logic and awakens the most subtle faculties of the human being. Through the words of this text, you will enter a world where intuition becomes a beacon illuminating the path to truth. As you listen to each lesson, you will discover that higher knowledge is not a distant destination, but a living experience, an expansion of the soul toward the highest realms. With every word spoken, with every concept shared, you will draw closer to unveiling the mysteries of the cosmos and the self, carrying with you a knowledge that will transform your perception of the world and of yourself. Prepare for a journey of revelation and transformation, a journey to the very heart of the deepest and truest knowledge. Welcome to an experience that will change your life forever. Preface by Marie Steiner. The magazine Luxferre, edited by Rudolf Steiner in service of spiritual science, expanded in 1904 through its merger with the Austrian journal Gnosis. From that point on, it carried the dual name Lux Gnosis. In it, Rudolf Steiner's articles were published, which later appeared as the book The Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, which, along with the books Theosophy and Occult Science, belongs to the foundational works of spiritual science from an anthroposophical perspective. A continuation of these articles appeared under the title The Stages of Higher Knowledge. Later, it was intended that these would form a second volume as a continuation of The Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. However, due to the overwhelming workload and the great demand for lectures, Rudolf Steiner could not devote the necessary attention to the magazine, despite its steadily increasing readership. Consequently, its publication had to cease, and the appearance of articles on the stages of higher knowledge had to be interrupted. We have often been asked to make them available again through a new edition. This book responds to that wish. Since the text is suddenly interrupted, the book cannot claim to be complete. Therefore, it was justified to question the appropriateness of a new edition. The viewpoints presented here, but not brought to a conclusion, have been published many times in other works by Rudolf Steiner in different forms and under different titles. However, for the seeker of the spirit, it remains a fact that the conquest of spiritual reality is only possible by returning time and again to spiritual content once worked through but never fully assimilated, and constantly experiencing anew the path that once showed the way to the realm of the spirit. The soul life of the person who works meditatively must remain so flexible that the vision offered by one path makes them more receptive to visions from other perspectives. The articles published here have historical value. They indicate the starting point of Rudolf Steiner's esoteric instructions. They show us how he became the pioneer precisely in this area, where, thanks to his guidance, humanity was first granted the freedom. With a worldview and a high sense of responsibility, he had to build a foundation and create a spiritual attitude through which man, by finding solid moral support within himself, could avoid falling prey to temptation and aberration, even in this freedom. To carry out such a work at a decisive turning point in history, in the midst of opposing forces, relying solely on oneself, required the tremendous ethical power that permeates all of Rudolf Steiner's life work, whose objectives are the welfare of humanity and the rescue of the Western world from the threatening collapse. He laid the foundations of his work in a way that corresponded to the demands of the time. For this, the synthesis of all knowledge was necessary. If we revisit these articles, written at the beginning of an astonishing life work that continued until March 30th, 1925, and which, in the early years of this century, had received a fateful impulse through its connection with the theosophical groups nourished by Eastern sources, the question arises, how can it be understood that Rudolf Steiner, who pointed the way to freedom also in esoteric life, towards full self-trust, and who allowed the student to promise obedience to their own higher self, which they would otherwise promise to the teacher, how can it be understood that Rudolf Steiner still insists in these articles on the need for strict trust from the student in the teacher, making the student dependent on the teacher, In reality, Rudolf Steiner only describes the student-teacher relationship as a relationship of trust. From the beginning, he avoided and rejected the authoritarian element. In ancient times, the initiating priests assumed full responsibility for the neophyte's initiation into the mysteries of spiritual existence and exercised their will over him. In this way, the student was both protected and guided, and could escape the dangers that would otherwise have dominated him. His ego still hovered over his physical coverings. His self-consciousness had not yet awakened. Awakening it more and more was the task of the progressive mystery training. By drawing attention to the cosmic master, Christian initiation diminished dependence on the personal teacher without completely eliminating it. In Rosicrucian training, this dependence gradually loses its personal character and transforms into a relationship of trust. The teacher helps the student, shows him the path he seeks but cannot find without assistance. The teacher gives him moral support, points out the dangers of vanity and the superstition of deceptive images that the student must learn to distinguish from true spiritual reality. Thus, the teacher is a helper willing to withdraw when trust is lacking. At the turning point of history in which we find ourselves, the teacher working for the present had to point to the past, present, and future of the human spiritual struggle and, starting with the education of the individual, had to structure his work in such a way that it would become a work for humanity, an acquired life element for posterity. Rudolf Steiner thus created a science of initiation in which every serious and morally striving human being can now find the foundation that will lead him. He can grasp the elements that sharpen his power of discernment while new worlds open before him. He will not need to grope in uncertainty, having received enough instruction to guide him until he finds the leader in the lands of the spirit. This was not the case before Rudolf Steiner began his spiritual work. His work is the science of initiation. Through it, what was hidden in the mysteries of the ancient temples is revealed, namely, along with the knowledge of cosmic evolution, the knowledge of Christ's imminent descent, and what was sealed in the Church. The redemptive work of humanity's liberation through Christ, and the gradual impregnation of the individual's ego with his power. In place of personal guidance, the requirement now is that the human being find the path to the ego of humanity, to Christ, through the forces of the spirit of the time. The consciousness of the individual human being becomes mature for the acceptance of the superior force of the ego. Self-consciousness rises to the spiritual throne. It is the work of the future, but only by walking on the soil of the past and preparing for the future can man work fruitfully for the present. Otherwise he struggles in vain. Even here the laws of metamorphosis apply. The future is created by the transformation of the present, rooted in the past. New elements emerge, just as the new spring follows the winter. The power of the sun shines through the earth. Everything that decomposes, subjected to transformation, is ignited to new life by the grace descending from above. Also in the esoteric realm, events develop in historical continuity, according to the law of upward evolution and the ebb and flow of life, declining and flourishing, until the seemingly sudden moment when the rays of grace burst forth, like the miracle of the radiant flower in the green plant world. However, without this transformation from form to form, carried out by wise powers, and the constant improvement in all domains of life, the new values, the gifts of the Spirit, the burning tongues of the Word would not descend upon us. Without the knowledge of such events, the recipients of these gifts would not be in a position to grasp what is to take place among them. The new great power could not be made effective. The future could not be saved. Souls eager for spiritual knowledge that approached Rudolf Steiner were the human material destined by fate and guided toward him by the age in which he had to work. From their needs and demands, he had to form the science of initiation based on cognition. His task was to awaken people from the indolence of the era regarding the spirit, so that they could become a bridge for the demands of the future. The most difficult part was to awaken the sense of inner freedom, of self-sufficiency, fully responsible for itself. Keeping this goal scrupulously in mind, Rudolf Steiner desired no other role among men than that of instructor and, when asked, counselor, an awakener of humanity's spiritual goals. He was capable of presenting spiritual facts because his thinking and his gaze were infused with life and unfolded, step by step, with the force of a natural organism. His spiritual work is before us, the restored unity of science, art, and religion. Chapter 1. The Stages of Higher Knowledge. In my book, How to Acquire Knowledge of Higher Worlds, the path to higher knowledge was traced until the encounter with the two guardians of the threshold. Now, the relationship of the soul with the different worlds will be described as it passes through the successive stages of knowledge. What will follow can be called the teachings of occult science. Before man embarks on the path of higher knowledge, he only knows the first of the 4 stages of cognition. This stage is what he occupies in ordinary life in the world of the senses. Even in what is called science, we only deal with this first stage of knowledge, because science simply elaborates ordinary cognition more thoroughly and in a disciplined manner. Assisted by instruments, the microscope, telescope, etc., the senses examine their surroundings more accurately than they could without these aids. However, man remains in the same cognitive stage whether he sees large things with the naked eye or observes small objects and phenomena with the help of a microscope. Also, in applying thought to facts and things, this science remains within the realm of everyday life. Man orders objects, describes them, compares them, tries to imagine their variations, and so on. The sharpest scientist does nothing fundamentally different in this sense, except to develop the methods of everyday observation into an art. His knowledge encompasses a broader range, becomes more complex and logical, but does not proceed to any other mode of cognition. In occult science, this first stage of knowledge is called material mode of cognition. It is followed by 3 higher stages, and there are even more beyond these. These stages of knowledge will be described here before proceeding to the description of the path of knowledge. Considering the ordinary method of scientific knowledge, apprehension through the senses as the first stage, we must differentiate the following 4 stages. Material knowledge, imaginative knowledge, inspirational knowledge, which can also be called of the nature of the will, intuitive knowledge. These stages will be discussed here. In ordinary sensory knowledge, 4 elements must be considered. 1. The object, which causes an impression on the senses. 2. The image, which the human being forms of this object. 3. The concept, by which the human being comes to a spiritual understanding of an object or event. 4. The self, which forms the image and concept based on the impression of the object. Before the human being forms an image, a representation, there is an object that provokes it. One does not form the object, one perceives it, and based on this object, the image arises. While we are looking at an object, we are concerned with the thing itself. The moment we turn away from it, only the image remains. The object is abandoned, the image is retained in memory. But one cannot stop at this phase of image creation. One must proceed to concepts. The distinction between image and concept is absolutely necessary if we wish to be clear on this point. Suppose one sees an object in the shape of a circle. Then one turns away and retains the image of the circle in memory. Up to that point, one does not have the concept of the circle. One reaches this concept only when one says to oneself, "A circle is a figure in which all points are equidistant from the center." Understanding of a thing is only achieved when a concept of it has been formed. There are all sorts of circles, small, large, red, blue, etc., but there is only one concept of circle. This will be addressed in more detail. For now, it will suffice to outline what is necessary to characterize the first 4 stages of knowledge. The 4th element to consider in material cognition is the self. In it occurs the union of images and concepts. The self stores the image in memory. Otherwise, a continuous inner life would not be possible. The images of things would remain only as long as the things themselves affected the soul. But inner life depends on the connection of one perception with another. The self orients itself in the present world because, in the presence of certain objects, images of similar objects from the past arise. It is clear that inner life would be impossible if the image of a thing could only be maintained as long as the thing itself was present. The self combines its concepts and thus makes an inquiry, calling on the understanding of the world. This union of concepts is what happens in forming judgments. A being who only possessed vaguely connected concepts would not find its way in the world. All human activity depends on the ability to combine concepts, that is, to form judgments. The material mode of cognition is based on the fact that man receives through his senses an impression of things and representations of the outer world. He has the power to perceive or sensitivity. The impression received from the outside is also called sensation. Therefore, in material cognition, we must consider four elements: sensation, image, concept, self. In the next higher stage of knowledge, the impression produced on the external senses, the sensation, disappears. There is no longer any external sensory object. Of the elements to which man is accustomed in ordinary knowledge, only three remain: image, concept, and self. Ordinary knowledge in a healthy individual does not create an image or concept when an object is not before the external senses. The self remains inactive. Whoever forms images whose corresponding sensory objects do not actually exist lives in fantasy. But the occult student acquires the same ability to form images without the stimulus of external sensory objects. The occult student must be able to form images even though no object touches his senses. Something must replace sensation. That something is imagination. In this stage, the images appear to the occult student in exactly the same way as if a sensory object had caused an impression. They are as vivid and true as sensory images, but they are not of material origin. Rather, they are of an animic spiritual nature. It is evident that the individual must first acquire this ability to form meaningful images without sensory impressions. This is achieved through meditation and the exercises described in the book Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Achievement. A person confined to the world of the senses lives only among images that have come to him through the senses. The imaginative person has a world of images that he has received from a higher source. Careful training is required to distinguish illusion from reality in this world of higher images. When such images first enter the soul of a person, they tend to say, "Ah, that is just fantasy, a mere overflow of my life of thoughts." This is very understandable because today people are accustomed to calling real only what is given to them based on the secure evidence of their senses, without effort on their part. One must first become accustomed to accepting as real things that originate from a different source. In this sense, one should never be too cautious about becoming a visionary. The ability to decide what is real and what is illusory in these higher realms can only come from experience, and this experience must be acquired in a calm and patient inner life. One must be fully prepared to endure the unpleasant tricks that illusion plays on us. Everywhere lurks the possibility that images may arise that result from delusions of the external senses or from an abnormal life. Every such possibility must be eliminated. One must first completely block the springs of the fantastic. Only then can one reach imagination. At this point, it will be clear that the world one has entered in this way is not only as real as the world of the senses, but much more real. In the third stage of knowledge, no images appear. Now the human being must deal only with the concept and the ego. While in the second stage, a world of images still surrounded him, remnants of the time when a vivid memory instantly evokes impressions of the external world. Without actually having such impressions, in the third stage, such images are no longer present. The human being lives entirely in a purely spiritual world. Anyone accustomed to strictly adhering to the senses will be tempted to believe that this world is pale and ghostly. But this is not the case at all. Neither does the world of images from the second stage have anything pale or dark about it. The same is true, without a doubt, for the images that remain in the memory when the external objects are no longer there. But the images of imagination have a vividness and expansiveness with which the shadowy images of the sensory world and even the shining and ephemeral physical world cannot be compared. Even this is nothing more than a shadow compared to the realm of imagination, now the world of the third stage of knowledge. Nothing in the sensory world can even suggest its richness and abundance. What was sensation in the first stage of knowledge, imagination in the second, here becomes inspiration. Inspiration gives the impressions, and the ego forms the concepts. If there is anything in the realm of the senses that can be compared to this world of inspiration, it is the world of tones that the sense of hearing opens to us. But now, it is not the tones of earthly music, but rather spiritual tones. One begins to hear what happens in the heart of things. The stone, the plant, etc., become spiritual words. The world begins to express its true nature to the soul. It may sound grotesque, but it is literally true, that in this stage of knowledge one spiritually hears the grass growing. The crystalline form is perceived as sound. The flower that opens speaks to people. The inspired person is able to proclaim the inner nature of things. Everything rises before their soul, as if from the dead in a new way. They speak a language that comes from another world and is the only one that can make the everyday world understandable. Finally, in the fourth stage of knowledge, inspiration also ceases. Of the elements typically observed in everyday knowledge, only the ego remains to be considered. The achievement of this stage by the occult student is marked by a defined inner experience. This experience manifests in the feeling that the person is no longer outside the things and events they recognize, but rather that they themselves are inside them. The images are not the object, but simply their trace. Likewise, inspiration does not deliver the object itself, but only speaks of it. But what now lives in the soul is actually the object itself. The ego has poured itself into all beings. It has merged with them. The real life of things within the soul is intuition. When it is said that through intuition man enters into all things, this is literally true. In ordinary life, man only has one intuition, namely that of the ego itself. For the ego cannot be perceived from the outside in any way. It can only be experienced in inner life. A simple consideration will clarify this fact. It is a consideration that psychologists have not applied with sufficient precision. Despite how unimpressive it may seem to a person with full understanding, it is of the utmost importance. And it is the following. A thing in the external world can be called by the same name by all men. Everyone can refer to a table as table, to a tulip as tulip. Everyone can address Mr. Miller as Mr. Miller. But there is one word that each person can apply only to themselves. It is the word I. No one else can call me I. To any other person, I am a you. Likewise, all others are a you to me. Only I can say I to myself. This is because each person lives not outside but within the I. Likewise, in intuitive cognition, one lives in all things. The perception of the I is the prototype of all intuitive cognition. Thus, to enter into all things one must first leave oneself. One must become selfless to merge with the I, the ego of another being. Meditation and concentration are the sure means to approach this stage of cognition, just as with the previous stages. Of course, they must be practiced in a calm and patient manner. Anyone who assumes they can violently elevate themselves to the higher worlds by forced means is mistaken. Those who surrender to such beliefs would expect the realities of the higher realms to present themselves in the same way as those of the sensory world. No matter how rich and vivid the worlds one can ascend to may be, they are delicate and subtle, whereas the world of the senses is coarse and crude. The most important thing to learn is that one must get used to considering as real something entirely different from what is designated as real in the realm of the senses. This is not easy. For this reason, many of those who voluntarily embark on the path of occultism are frightened when taking the first steps. Someone expected to encounter things like tables and chairs and instead finds spirits. But since the spirits are not like tables and chairs, they seem like illusions. The only thing wrong is the unusual. One must first acquire the correct feeling for the spiritual world. Then one will not only see, but also recognize what is spiritual. A large part of occult training involves this proper recognition and valuation of the spiritual. The state of sleep must first be considered in order to understand imaginative cognition. As long as a person has not reached a higher stage of cognition beyond the material, the soul truly lives during sleep, but is unable to perceive the world in which it dwells in the sleeping state. It is in this world like a blind person among material objects. The soul has withdrawn from the organs of the external senses, such as the eyes, ears, ordinary brain activity, etc., during sleep. It does not receive any impressions through the senses. Now, what does it do during sleep? One must realize that in waking life the soul is continuously active. It receives impressions from the external senses and works on them. That is its activity. It ceases to do so during sleep, but it is not idle. While asleep, the soul works on its own body, which is exhausted by the activities of the day. This manifests as fatigue. During sleep, the soul cares for its own body in order to prepare it for further work when it wakes up again. From this, it follows that proper sleep is essential for bodily well-being. Therefore, the person who does not sleep enough prevents the soul from performing this necessary repair work on the body. The consequence is that the body deteriorates. The forces with which the soul works on the body during sleep are the same ones with which it works in the waking state. But in the latter case, they are used to absorb impressions from the external senses and work on them. Now, when imaginative cognition approaches the person, part of the forces directed toward the body during sleep must be employed in another way. Through these forces, the organs of spiritual perception are formed, which provide the soul with the ability not only to live in a higher world, but also to perceive it. Thus, during sleep, the soul no longer only works on the body, but also on itself. This work results from meditation, concentration, and other exercises. It has often been said in my writings on higher knowledge that specific instructions for such exercises are given only from one individual to another. No one should undertake such exercises on their own, for only someone experienced in this field can judge what effect is produced in a person who embarks on withdrawing the soul's work from the body and applying it in a higher way. Meditation, concentration, and other exercises cause the soul to withdraw for a time from its union with the organs of the senses. It then immerses itself in itself. In the early stages of this immersion in itself, its inner activity differs very little from its usual daily habits. In its inner work, the soul certainly uses the same thoughts, feelings, and sensations that belong to ordinary life. The more accustomed the soul becomes to being, to some extent, blind and deaf to the material environment, the more it lives within itself, the better it prepares for inner realizations. What is achieved by immersion in the inner life bears fruit primarily in the sleeping state. When at night the soul frees itself from the body, what has been stimulated in it by the exercises of the day continues to work. The organs take form within it, through which it connects with a higher environment, exactly as through the organs of the external senses it had previously connected with the physical world. From the darkness of the nocturnal environment, the luminous phenomena of the higher world emerge. At first, this communion is tender and intimate. It should be noted that for a long time, upon waking, the daylight will veil the nighttime experiences with a dense fog. The memory that perception took place during the night only gradually appears. For the student does not easily learn to pay attention to the delicate formations of his soul that, in the course of development, begin to mix with the common experiences of daily life from the senses. At first, such soul formations resemble what is generally called casual impressions. It depends on learning to distinguish what belongs to the ordinary world from what, by its nature, presents itself as a manifestation of higher worlds. In a calm, introspective mental life, this discernment must be acquired. It is necessary first to develop a sense of the value and significance of those intimate formations of the soul that blend with daily life as though they were casual impressions, but which are in reality memories of the nocturnal communion with a higher world. As soon as one grasps these things in a crude manner and applies the measuring stick of sensory life to them, they fade away. From the above, it follows that through work in a higher world, the soul must withdraw part of its activity from the body, which is ordinarily assigned to it with great care. It leaves the body, to some extent, dependent on itself, and the body needs a substitute for what the soul had previously done for it. If such a substitute is not found, it risks being harmed by detrimental forces, for one must be clear on the fact that man is continually exposed to the influences of his environment. In reality, he lives only through the influences of this environment. Among them, the realms of visible nature are the first to be considered. Man himself belongs to this visible nature. If the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms and other human beings did not exist around him, he could not live. If one could imagine an individual separated from the earth and lifted into the surrounding space, he would immediately perish as a physical being, just as the hand would wither if separated from the body. Just as it would be a formidable illusion for a human hand to believe it can exist without the body, so too would it be a powerful deception for a man to hold that he can exist as a physical being without the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms, and without other humans. But in addition to the aforementioned kingdoms, there are three others that generally escape man's attention. These are the three elemental realms. They are, in a certain sense, below the mineral realm. There are beings that do not condense into the mineral state, but nevertheless exist and influence man. More information about these elemental realms can be found in my cosmic memory, as well as in my observations about them in theosophy. Thus, man is exposed to the influences of the realms of nature that, in a certain sense, must be called invisible. Now, when the soul works on the body, a considerable part of its activity consists of regulating the influences of the elemental realms in such a way that they benefit man. At the moment the soul withdraws part of its activity from the body, harmful powers from the elemental realms may seize it. This presents a danger to higher development. Therefore, care must be taken that as soon as the soul withdraws from the body, it is only accessible to the good influences of the elemental world. If this is not taken into account, the ordinary man deteriorates, to some extent, physically and also morally, despite having accessed the higher worlds. While the soul resides in the higher realms, pernicious forces insinuate themselves into the dense physical body and the etheric body. This is why certain bad qualities, which had previously been contained by the soul's regulating power, may now surface due to lack of precaution. Men previously of good moral nature may, under such circumstances, when entering the higher worlds, reveal all kinds of low inclinations, increased selfishness, falsehood, revenge, anger, etc. No one alarmed by this fact should be discouraged from ascending to the higher worlds, but care must be taken to prevent such occurrences. The lower nature of man must be fortified and made inaccessible to the dangerous influences of the elemental realms. This can be achieved through the conscious cultivation of certain virtues. These virtues are outlined in the writings on spiritual development. This is why they must be sought carefully. The following qualities must be developed. First, the human being must, in a fully conscious manner, be continually attentive to the enduring in all things, distinguishing the imperishable from the transient and directing attention toward it. In all things and beings, one can assume or discern something that remains after the transient appearance has vanished. If I look at a plant, I first observe it as it presents itself to the senses. No one should neglect this, for no one who has not first thoroughly familiarized themselves with the perishable aspect will detect the eternal in things. Those who continually fear that focusing their attention on the spiritually imperishable will cause them to lose the freshness and naturalness of life do not really understand what it is about. But when I look at a plant in this way, I can realize that within it there is a lasting vital impulse that will reappear in a new plant long after the current one has turned to dust. Such an orientation toward things should be adopted in the entire temperament of life. Next, the heart must be focused on everything that is valuable and genuine, which one must learn to value more than the fleeting and insignificant. Thirdly, 6 qualities must be developed: control of the world of thoughts, control of actions, endurance, impartiality, trust in the surrounding world, and inner balance. The control of the world of thoughts can be achieved if one takes the trouble to combat the errant will of thoughts and feelings that, in the ordinary human being, constantly rise and fall. In everyday life, a person is not the master of their thoughts. They are driven by them. Naturally, this cannot be otherwise, as life pushes the person, and as a practical individual they must yield to it. In ordinary life there is no alternative. But if one wishes to reach a higher world, one must set aside at least brief periods in which one becomes the master of their world of thoughts and feelings. There, in complete inner freedom, one places a thought at the center of their soul, where otherwise ideas impose themselves from outside. Then one tries to keep all intrusive thoughts and feelings away, and link only what one wants to admit as appropriate to the first thought. Such an exercise has a beneficial effect on the soul, and through it, also on the body. Control of actions involves a similar regulation of them through inner freedom. A good start occurs when one sets out to do something regularly that would not have occurred to them in ordinary life. For in the latter, the person is indeed driven to their actions from outside, but even the smallest action undertaken from inner initiative achieves more in the indicated direction than all the pressures of external life. Endurance consists of keeping a distance from any whim that could be described as a change from exulting to the highest heavens to grieving to death. A person is tossed about between all kinds of moods. Pleasure delights them, pain depresses them. This has its justification, but the one who seeks the path of higher knowledge must be able to mitigate both joy and sorrow. They must become stable. They must give themselves moderately to pleasurable impressions and also to painful experiences. They must move with dignity through both. they must never be discouraged or perplexed. This does not lead to a lack of feelings, but rather to the person finding the stable center within the ebb and flow of the life surrounding them. They always have themselves at hand. Another important quality is the sense of saying yes. This can be developed in someone who, in all things, has an eye for the good, beautiful, and purposeful aspects of life, rather than primarily for the blameworthy, ugly, and contradictory. There is a beautiful Persian legend about Christ, which illustrates the meaning of this quality. A dead dog lies in the road. Among the passers-by is Christ. Everyone else moves away from the ugly sight. Only Christ stops and speaks with admiration about the beautiful teeth of the animal. It is possible to look at things this way, and anyone who seeks this seriously can find something worthy of recognition in all things, even the most repulsive. The fertility of things lies not in what they lack, but in what they have. Furthermore, it is important to develop the quality of impartiality. Every human being has gone through their own experiences and from them has formed a fixed set of opinions by which they direct their life. While conformity with experience is, of course, necessary, on the other hand, it is also important for anyone who wishes to progress through spiritual development to a higher knowledge to always keep an eye open for anything new and unknown that presents itself. They will be as cautious as possible with judgments like, "That is impossible. That can't be." Whatever opinion has been formed from previous experiences, they should be willing at any time when encountering something new to admit a new opinion. When the 5 qualities mentioned have been acquired, the 6th appears as something natural, inner balance, the harmony of spiritual forces. The human being must find in themselves a spiritual center of gravity that gives them firmness and security in the face of everything that pulls them this way and that in life. One should not shy away from participating in everything surrounding life, and should allow everything to act upon them. The correct path is not to flee from all activities that distract from life, but rather to immerse oneself fully in it, along with the firm and secure protection of inner balance and harmony. Finally, the will for freedom must be considered by the seeker. Whoever finds in themselves the support and foundation for everything they do already possesses this attribute. It is so difficult to achieve due to the necessary balance between the openness of the senses to all that is great and good and the simultaneous rejection of all compulsion. It is very easy to say that external influence is incompatible with freedom. What matters is that both are reconciled within the soul. When someone tells me something and I accept it under the coercion of their authority, I am not free. But I am no less unfree if I close myself off to the good that could be received in this way, because then worse elements of my own soul act as compulsion upon me. Freedom means not only that I am free from the compulsion of an external authority, but above all that I am not subject to my own prejudices, opinions, sensations, and feelings. The correct path is not blind submission to what is received, but allowing ourselves to be open to suggestion, receiving it impartially so that we can recognize it freely. An external authority should exercise no more influence than to make us say, "I make myself free only by following the good that is in it, that is, by making it my own." An authority based on hidden wisdom will exercise absolutely no influence other than in this way. It gives what it has to give, not to gain power over the receiver, but only so that through the gift, the receiver may become enriched and more free. The meaning of the qualities mentioned above has already been addressed in the discussion of the lotus flowers, knowledge of the higher worlds. There, their relationship with the development of the 12-petaled lotus flower in the region of the heart, and with the currents of the etheric body connected to it, was shown. From what has been said, it now becomes clear that these qualities allow the seeker to dispense with those forces that previously benefited the physical body during sleep, and which, due to their development, must now gradually be withdrawn from this task. Under such influences, imaginative knowledge is developed. Chapter 2. Imagination. It is impossible to make true progress in penetrating the higher worlds without going through the stage of imaginative knowledge. This does not mean at all that, during occult training, the human being is forced to remain in the imaginative stage for a certain period, as if it were something like a class to attend in school. In certain cases, this may be necessary, but by no means as a general rule. It entirely depends on what the student of occultism has experienced before starting their occult training. The spiritual environment of the student of occultism is important in this regard, and depending on their orientation toward this spiritual environment, various methods have been established for traveling the path of knowledge. It can be of utmost importance to know the following if one is preparing to undergo occult training. This is not considered merely as an interesting theory, but as something through which multiple practical points of view can be gained if one wishes to succeed in the path to higher knowledge. Those who strive for a higher development often say, "I wish to perfect myself spiritually. I wish to develop the higher man within me, but I have no desire for the manifestations of the astral world." This is understandable when one takes into account the descriptions of the astral world found in books dealing with these matters. There, undoubtedly, talk is given of appearances and beings that bring all sorts of dangers to people. It will be said that, under the influence of such beings, a person can easily suffer harm to their moral disposition and mental health. The reader will be told that in these regions, the wall that divides the good path from the bad path is as thin as a spider's web, and that the fall into immeasurable abysses, the fall into total depravity, is too close. However, the point of view often adopted regarding the occult path is not in any way correct. The only reasonable point of view is one that says, rather, that no one should be dissuaded from walking the path of higher knowledge because of the dangers, but that in all cases strict care must be taken to weather these dangers. It may happen that someone seeking the guidance of an occult master is advised to postpone the real training for a while and first undergo certain experiences in ordinary life, or learn things that can be learned in the physical world. It will then be the task of the occult master to give the seeker the correct instructions on how to accumulate such experiences and learn such things. In most cases, the occult master will proceed in this manner. If the student is now sufficiently attentive to what happens to them after having come into contact with the occult master, they will observe many things. They will discover that from now on, things happen to them by accident, and that they can observe things to which they would never have been exposed without this connection to the occult master. If the student does not realize this and becomes impatient, it is because they have not paid enough attention to what has been happening to them. One should not believe that the master's influence over the student manifests in magical tricks that are clearly visible. This influence is rather an intimate matter, and anyone who wants to explore its nature and essence without having first reached a certain stage of occult training is surely bound to go astray. The student harms themselves in all cases where they become impatient with the waiting period prescribed for them. Their progress will not be rapid because of it. On the contrary, their progress would slow down if they were to begin the training they often impatiently await too soon. If the student allows the waiting period or the other advice and suggestions given to them by the occult master to influence them properly, they will truly be preparing to withstand certain trials and dangers that approach when they encounter the inevitable stage of imagination. This stage is inevitable for this reason. Anyone seeking communication with the higher worlds without having gone through it can only do so unconsciously and is condemned to grope in the dark. Without imagination, one can have a slight notion of this higher world. Without it, one can certainly have the feeling of being united with our God or our higher self. But in this way, one cannot reach true knowledge in full consciousness and clear light. Therefore, all that is said about not needing to come to terms with the lower spiritual worlds, the astral and devacanic realms, and that what is necessary is for man to awaken to the God within, is nothing but an illusion. But true occultism has nothing to do with such efforts. It does not require anyone to become a disciple, but in the one who seeks their discipline, it will not awaken merely a faint perception of themselves as similar to God, but will also try to open their spiritual eyes to what truly exists in the higher worlds. Of course, the divine self is contained in every human being. It is in every created being. In the stone, the plant, and the animal, the divine self is also contained and active. But it is not so much a matter of feeling and knowing this in general, as it is of entering into a living connection with the manifestations of this divine self. Just as one can murmur again and again that this world contains the divine self veiled within it, and not know anything about the physical world because of it, the one who seeks the divine realm of spirits, only in vague and indeterminate generalities knows nothing of the higher worlds. One must open the eyes and contemplate the revelation of divinity in the things of the physical world, in the stone, in the plant, and not merely dream that all of this is only appearances, with the true form of God somehow hidden behind them. No, God reveals himself in his creations, and the one who wishes to know God must learn to recognize the true essence of these creations. Therefore, one must also learn to contemplate what truly happens and lives in the higher worlds if one wishes to know the divine. The awareness that the God-man dwells within oneself can at most provide a beginning, but this beginning, when experienced in the correct way, rises to a real elevation to the higher worlds. But this is only possible for the one in whom the spiritual senses have been developed. Any other point of view merely arrives at the perspective, I will remain as I am, and will only achieve what is possible for me to achieve in this way. But the occultist's goal is to become a different human being, to contemplate and experience things other than the usual. It is precisely for this that it is necessary to go through imaginative knowledge. It has already been said that this stage of imagination should not be conceived as a school class that one must pass through. It must be understood that, particularly in today's life, there are people who bring with them the necessary conditions that allow the occult master to awaken inspired and intuitive knowledge in them simultaneously, or almost so, with the imaginative. But it should not be understood at all that anyone can bypass the imaginative stage. The cause of the danger inherent in imaginative knowledge has already been pointed out in my book, The Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. This cause is that by entering that world, the human being loses, in a sense, the ground beneath their feet. The source of their security in the physical world is lost for the moment, according to all appearances. When perceiving something in the physical world, they ask, where does this perception come from? Most of the time, this is done unconsciously, but it is quite clear unconsciously that the causes of perception are objects out in space. Colors, sounds, smells come from these objects. The colors would not appear floating freely in space, nor would the sounds be heard, without the consciousness of the objects to which these colors as qualities belong, and from which these tones proceed. This awareness that objects and entities cause physical perceptions gives them, and thereby the human being themselves, their security and stability. One who has perceptions without external causes is called abnormal and morbid. Such perceptions without causes are called illusions, hallucinations, visions. Now, first of all, the entire imaginative world, viewed entirely from the outside, consists of such hallucinations, visions, and illusions. It has been pointed out how, through occult training, such visions, etc., are artificially produced. By concentrating the consciousness on a seed or on a dying plant, certain forms are conjured before the soul that, to begin with, are nothing but hallucinations. The formation of the flame, which is discussed here, appears in the soul through the observation of a plant or similar, and after some time, it completely separates from the plant. It should be considered externally at the same level as a hallucination. The same happens in occult training when entering the imaginative world. What was once thought to come from things out in space, or clung to them as properties, colors, sounds, smells, etc., now floats freely in space. Perceptions detach from all external things and float freely in space or fly through it. However, it is strictly known that the things we see before us did not cause these perceptions. They are self-induced by the human being. This is how one feels, as if they have lost the ground beneath their feet. In ordinary life in the physical world, one must guard against those inner images that do not come from things and that lack any basis or foundation. But to evoke imaginative knowledge, the essential thing is to have colors, sounds, smells, etc., completely detached from all things, floating freely in space. The next step toward imaginative knowledge is to find a new ground and foundation for the images that are now adrift. This must occur in the other world that is about to be revealed. New things and entities take possession of these inner images. In the physical world, for example, the color blue remains in a cornflower. In the imaginative world, it should not remain floating freely. It flows, so to speak, toward some being, and while at first it floated loosely, now it becomes the expression of a being. Something speaks through it that the observer can only perceive in the imaginary world, and so these floating images gather around defined centers. It becomes evident that beings speak to us through them, and just as in the physical world there are corporeal things and beings to which colors, sounds, smells, etc. are connected, or from which they derive. Now the spiritual beings speak through them. These spiritual beings are, in fact, always there. They hover continuously around humans, but they cannot reveal themselves unless given the opportunity. This opportunity is given when one invokes the ability to let sounds, colors, etc. arise before their soul, even if they are not provoked by any physical object. The facts and spiritual beings are completely different from the objects and entities of the physical world. In common language, it is not easy to find an expression that remotely describes this difference. Perhaps the best way to approach it is to say that in the imaginative world, everything speaks to the human as if it were directly intelligent, while in the physical world, intelligence can only reveal itself indirectly through corporeality. This is precisely what gives the imaginative world mobility and freedom, the absence of the external object medium and the spiritual lives with full immediacy in the tones, colors, etc., that float freely. Now, the source of danger threatening the human being in this world lies in the fact that they perceive the manifestations of the spiritual beings, but not the beings themselves. This happens while they remain only in the imaginative world and do not elevate themselves further. However, if the occult master were to awaken these faculties prematurely, without thoroughly introducing the student to the realm of imagination, the higher world would only have for them a shadowy and ghostly existence. All the glorious fullness of the images in which it must be revealed would be lost when one truly enters it. Here lies the reason why the student of occultism needs a guide. For the student, the imaginative world is initially only a world of images, whose meaning they mostly do not understand. But the occult master knows to which things and entities these images belong in an even higher world. If the student trusts them, they can be sure that later connections will be revealed to them that they cannot yet penetrate. In the physical world, objects in space were their own guides. The student was able to check the accuracy of their inner images of them. The corporeal reality is the rock upon which all hallucinations and illusions must shatter. This rock disappears into an abyss when entering the imaginative world. Therefore, the master must serve as another of those rocks. Based on what the master is able to offer, the student must perceive the reality of the new world. From this, one can judge how great the trust in the master must be in any occult training worthy of the name. When one can no longer believe in the master, in this higher world, exactly the same thing happens as if, in the physical world, everything upon which one had built their faith in the reality of their perceptions was suddenly taken away. Apart from this fact, there is another reason why a human could be plunged into confusion if they enter the imaginative world without guidance. The student of occultism must, in the first place, learn to know themselves as distinct from all other spiritual beings. In physical life, a human has feelings, desires, yearnings, passions, ideas, etc. It is true that all these are caused by things and beings from the external world, but the human being knows well that they form their inner world, distinguishing them from the objects of the outer world as what happens within their soul. But as soon as the imaginative sense is awakened, this ease of differentiation ceases entirely. Their own feelings, ideas, passions, etc. literally come out of them and take form, color, and tone. Now they are confronted with them as if they were objects and beings totally strange in the physical world. It will be understood that confusion can become complete if one recalls what was said in the chapter Some Results of Initiation, from my book, The Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. There it is described how the imaginative world appears to the observer. Everything there appears inverted as in a reflected image. What arises from the human being appears as if it is coming toward them from the outside. A desire they harbor transforms into a form, for example, into a fantastical animal, or again into an entity resembling a human being. It appears to assault them, attack them, or force them to do this or that. Thus, it may happen that the human finds themselves surrounded by a totally fantastical world, often charming and seductive, sometimes also horrific, with fluttering forms. It would be a grave mistake to believe that it is easy to distinguish between this self-transformed into images, on the one hand, and the real spiritual world, on the other. At first, the student will frankly be unable to make this distinction. The same image may come from some spiritual being speaking to humans, or from something inside the soul, and if development is overly rushed at this point, there is the danger of never learning to separate the two things in an orderly manner. The utmost caution must be the rule in this regard. Now, the confusion will be even greater in that the desires and longings of the soul take on images that are exactly opposite to what they truly are. One might assume, for example, that vanity cloaks itself in an image in this way. It might appear as a charming form that promises the most wonderful things if its dictates are fulfilled. Its pronouncements seem to set entirely good goals for which it is worth striving. If followed, they plunge one into moral ruin and other forms of destruction. Conversely, a good quality of the soul might be cloaked in unattractive garb. At this point, only the true knowers can differentiate, and only a personality insensible to weakening with respect to a correct goal stands firm against the seductive artifices of the images of their own soul. From these considerations, it will be understood how necessary the guidance of a master is, one who, with a sure sense, makes the student attentive to what in this realm is ghostly and what is true. It is not necessary to believe that the master must always be behind the student dot. The presence of the teacher near the hidden student in space is not the most important thing. Certainly, there are moments when such spatial presence is desirable, and also when it is absolutely necessary. But on the other hand, the occult teacher finds ways to stay in contact with the student even when physically distant. Moreover, it should be observed that much of what takes place between teacher and student in this realm, when they are together, often continues to function for months or even years afterwards. But there is something that will certainly destroy the necessary bond between teacher and student. This happens if the student loses trust in the teacher. It is particularly detrimental if this bond of trust is broken before the student has learned to distinguish the illusory reflections of their own soul from true reality. At this point, one might argue that if the connection with the teacher happens in this way, the occult student loses all freedom and independence. They submit, so to speak, entirely into the hands of the teacher. However, this is not the case at all. The various methods of occult training certainly differ in terms of the student's dependence on the teacher. One might require more or less of this dependence. It is relatively greater in the method followed by Eastern occultists, which is still taught by them today as their own. This dependence is proportionally smaller in the so-called Christian initiation, and, properly speaking, its complete omission occurs in the path of knowledge pursued by the so-called Rosicrucian schools, which have been advancing this path since the 14th century. In this path, the teacher cannot in any way be ignored. That is impossible. But all dependence on the teacher ceases. In the continuation of these reflections, it will be explained how this is possible. There, we will precisely explain the differences between these three paths of knowledge: Eastern, Christian, and Rosicrucian. In the Rosicrucian approach, there is nothing that disturbs the modern human sense of freedom. This continuation will also describe how one person or another, as an occult student, can follow not the Rosicrucian path, but the Eastern or the ancient Christian one, although today the Rosicrucian path is the most natural. This path, as will be seen in due time, is not at all anti-Christian. A person can follow this path without endangering their Christianity, just as one who believes they are at the peak of the modern scientific worldview can do so. But perhaps another explanation is needed. One might be tempted to ask whether the occult student could avoid going through the delusions of their own soul. But if this were the case, they would never achieve that highly desired independent discernment. For no other means can so effectively capture the singular nature of the imaginative world as by observing the soul itself. To begin with, man knows the inner life of his soul from one side. He is immersed in it, and this is precisely what the occult student must learn, not just to look at things from the outside, but to observe them as though he himself were inside them. If his own world of thoughts now presents itself as something strange to him, and he knows something from one side, he can still learn to know it from another. He himself must become, to some extent, the first example of such knowledge. Here, in the physical world, he is used to something very different. Here he sees all other things only from the outside, but he experiences himself only from within. As long as he remains in the physical world, he will never be able to see beyond the surface of things. He can never step out of himself, leave his skin, so to speak, to observe himself from the outside. This objective observation of oneself is literally his first obligation in occult training. This helps him to learn to look beneath the surface of external facts and beings. Chapter 3. Inspiration. From the description of imagination, it follows that the occult student leaves the realm of external sensory experiences. To a much higher degree, this is the case with inspiration. Here, representation, the formation of the image, is much less based on what can be termed an external stimulus. Man must find the strength within himself to form representations of things. He must be internally active at a much higher level than in the case of external cognition. There he simply surrenders to external impressions, and these cause the images. This kind of surrender ceases when we reach inspiration. There is no longer an eye that supplies colors, nor an ear that supplies sounds, etc. The entire content of the representations must be modeled largely by the individual's own activity, consequently by purely spiritual processes, and the manifestation of the higher world must be imprinted upon what the individual has created through his inner activity. A peculiar contradiction seems to appear in such a description of the world of higher cognition. The individual, to some extent, must be the creator of his own representations, but of course he must not allow these representations to be his own creation. The processes of the higher world must express themselves through them, just as the processes of the lower world express themselves through the perceptions of the eyes, ears, etc. But an inevitable contradiction arises in the description of this mode of cognition, because this is exactly what the occult student must make their own on the path of inspiration. They must achieve, through their inner activity, a result that in ordinary life is externally forced. Why, in ordinary life, do the images that represent the external world not proceed arbitrarily? Because man must make his inner images conform to external objects. Any arbitrariness of the ego disappears because the objects say, "We are this or that." The objects themselves tell how they must be thought. The ego has nothing to decide about it. He who does not conform to the objects has erroneous thoughts and soon realizes how little success he would have with them in the world. This necessary attitude of man toward the things of the external world can be designated in cognition by the term disinterested. Man must achieve a disinterested attitude toward things, and the external world is his instructor in this disinterest. It removes all illusions, all fantastic notions, all illogical judgments, all lack of objectivity, simply by placing the correct image before his senses. If the individual wants to prepare for inspiration, he must develop his inner nature in such a way that this disinterest is his own, even when nothing external forces him to it. He must learn to create inwardly, but in such a way that his ego does not play any arbitrary role in this creative activity. The difficulties to be considered in achieving such disinterest become all the more evident when considering which psychic powers are especially necessary for inspiration. Three fundamental powers of the soul are distinguished: representation, thinking, feeling, and will. In everyday sensory cognition, representations are stimulated into existence by external objects, and through these externally stimulated representations, the directions taken by feeling and will are determined. For example, a person sees an object. It gives them pleasure, and as a result, they desire the object. The pleasure originates in feeling, and through feeling, will is awakened, just as feeling in turn has received its imprint from thinking. But the ultimate foundation of thinking, feeling, and willing is the external object. Another example would be the following. A person witnesses an event. They become frightened. They flee the scene of the event. Again, the external events are the initial cause. They are perceived through the senses, become representations, and the feeling of fear arises. The will, which expresses itself in the flight, is the result. In inspiration, any such external object disappears. The senses do not come into play for perception, therefore they cannot give rise to representations. From this side, no influence is exerted on feeling and will. However, it is precisely from these two, as a mother substance, that in inspiration representations arise and grow internally. If the mother substance is healthy, true representations will emerge. If it is not, errors and illusions will arise. Just as certainly as the inspirations that arise from a healthy feeling and will can be revelations from a higher world, so certainly do errors, delusions, and fantastic notions concerning a higher world arise from a confused feeling and will. The occult training, therefore, commits to indicating how the human being can make their feelings and will impulses productive in a healthy way for inspiration. As in all matters of occult training, it is necessary here to regulate and form the soul life intimately. First, certain feelings must be developed which in ordinary life are only slightly known. Some of these feelings will be alluded to here. Among the most important is a greater sensitivity to truth and falsehood, to good and evil. Certainly the ordinary person has similar feelings, but they must be developed by the occult student to a much higher degree. Suppose someone has made a logical mistake. Another person sees this mistake and corrects it. Let it be clear how great the role of judgment and intellect is in such a correction, and how slight the feeling of pleasure for what is correct and discomfort for what is erroneous. Without a doubt, this does not mean that pleasure and corresponding displeasure are non-existent, but the degree to which they are present in ordinary life must be elevated to an unlimited degree in occult training. The occult student must systematically direct their attention to their soul life, and must make the logical error a source of pain, no less unbearable than physical pain, and conversely, that what is correct provides them with true joy and delight. Thus, where another only engages their intellect and power of judgment, the occult student must learn to live through the entire range of emotions, from pain to enthusiasm, from afflictive tension to transports of delight in possessing the truth. In fact, they must learn to feel something like hatred for what the normal person only experiences in a cold and sober way as incorrect. They must ignite in themselves a love for the truth that has a personal character, so personal, so warm, as the lover feels for the beloved. Certainly in our cultured circles much is said about love for the truth. However, what is meant by this cannot be compared at all with what the occult student must go through in the silent and inner work of the soul toward this end. As a test, they must patiently, time and again, present to themselves this or that true thing, this or that false thing, and engage with it, not only to train their judgment for a sober discrimination between true and false, but they must acquire an entirely personal relationship with all of it. It is absolutely true that at the beginning of such training, the human being may fall into what could be called hypersensitivity. An incorrect judgment they hear in their surroundings, an inconsistency, etc., may cause them almost unbearable pain. Therefore, care must be taken in this respect during training. Otherwise, there could be great dangers to the student's soul balance. If care is taken to keep the character firm, soul storms may arise, but the human being will still retain the power to conduct themselves in the external world with a harmonious appearance and bearing. A mistake is made in all cases when the occult student is set in opposition to the external world, so that they find it unbearable or wish to flee from it entirely. The higher world of feelings must not be cultivated at the expense of a well-balanced activity and work in the external world. Therefore, the strengthening of the power to resist external impressions must appear in a corresponding measure to the inner elevation of the life of feelings. The practical occult training, therefore, indicates to the human being that they should never undertake the exercises mentioned above to develop the world of feelings without simultaneously developing an appreciation for tolerance that life requires of people. They must be capable of feeling the sharpest pain if someone expresses an erroneous opinion, and at the same time be perfectly tolerant of this person, because their thought is equally clear in their mind that this person is bound to judge in this way, and their opinion must be considered a fact. Of course, it is true that the inner being of the occult scientist will gradually transform into a double life. In their pilgrimage through life, increasingly rich processes occur in their soul, and a second world becomes more independent of what the external world offers. It is precisely this double existence that will bear fruit in the authentic practice of life. What results from it is quick judgment and infallible certainty in decision-making. While anyone who is removed from such education must go through long trains of thought, tossed back and forth between resolution and perplexity, the occult scientist will quickly examine life situations and discern the hidden relationships that are not visible at first glance. Often, they need a lot of patience to synchronize with the slowness with which another person is capable of understanding something that for them is as fast as an arrow. Until now, we have only spoken of the qualities that must be developed in the life of feelings so that inspiration can occur in the right way. The next question is, how do feelings become fruitful so that they are represented accurately for the world of inspiration? If one wants to understand what occult science can offer in response to this question, it is necessary to acknowledge that the soul life of the human being always possesses a certain treasure of feelings, in addition to those stimulated by the perceptions of the senses. The human being feels, so to speak, much more than what things force them to feel, except that in ordinary life, this excess is directed in a way that, through occult training, must be transformed into another direction. Let us take, for example, a feeling of anxiety or fear. It may become very clear that often fear or anxiety are greater than they would be if they were in true proportion to the corresponding external event. Imagine that the occult student is energetically working on themselves with the goal of not feeling any more fear or anxiety than what is justified by the corresponding external events. Now, a certain amount of fear or anxiety always implies an expenditure of soul force. This soul force is actually lost when fear or anxiety occurs. The student truly retains this soul force when they deny themselves the fear or anxiety or other similar feelings and keep it available for some other purpose. If they repeat such processes frequently, they will accumulate an internal treasure of these soul forces continually preserved, and the occult student will soon discover that from such economies of feelings, the seeds of those internal images will arise that will bring forth the revelations of a higher life. Such things cannot be proven in the ordinary sense. The occult student can only be advised to do this or that, and if they do, they should observe the undoubted results. A careless examination of what has been described could easily present as a contradiction, the requirement, on the one hand, to enrich the world of feelings, with feelings of pleasure or pain that must be kindled by what would otherwise only awaken intellectual judgment, and on the other hand, to speak almost in the same breath of the economy of feelings. This contradiction quickly disappears if it is considered that the economies must be carried out in the feelings aroused by external senses. What is preserved there appears, conversely, as an enrichment of spiritual experience, and it is absolutely true that the feelings thus preserved in the world of sensory perception are not only freed in the other sphere but are creative in it. However, little would be achieved if we were to remain stagnant in the economies mentioned earlier. To obtain greater results, much more is needed. The soul must be supplied with a treasure of power to create feelings far greater than what is possible through this alone. For example, as an exercise, one must expose oneself to certain external impressions and then completely deny oneself the feelings that normally arise as a result. One must, for instance, face an event that normally excites the soul and absolutely forbid oneself the excitation. This can be accomplished by confronting such an experience or evoking it imaginatively. The imaginative method is even better for genuinely fruitful occult training. As the student embarks on imagination, either before preparing for inspiration or simultaneously with it, they must be in a condition to imaginatively place an event before the soul with the same force as if it were actually happening. Thus, if, in the course of long inner work, the student repeatedly subjects themselves to certain things and events, denying themselves the corresponding normal feelings, a fertile ground for inspiration will be created within their soul. By the way, it should be noted here that anyone describing such training for inspiration can fully appreciate the possible objections to such a description from the point of view of current culture. Not only can objections be raised, but people may even smile arrogantly and say, "Inspiration cannot be taught pedantically. It is a natural gift of genius." Yes, from the perspective of modern culture, it may certainly seem almost comical to speak of a process that this culture does not admit as explainable, but this very culture is not aware of how little it is capable of thinking through its own processes of thought to the end. Those who would expect a disciple of this culture to believe that a more developed animal did not evolve slowly, but appeared suddenly, would soon hear that a cultured person, in the modern sense, would not believe in such a miracle. Such a belief would be superstition. Now, in the realm of the soul's life, someone with such modern education is not themselves, but a victim of a crude superstition in the style of their own opinions. For the same reason, they will not recognize that a more fully developed soul must also have evolved and could not have emerged into existence suddenly as a gift of nature. Of course, externally, many geniuses seem to have suddenly appeared from nowhere in some mysterious way, but this only seems so to materialistic superstition. The spiritual scientist knows that the value placed on genius regarding the life of a person born in this condition of nothingness is simply the result of their preparation for inspiration during a previous life on Earth. In the theoretical realm, materialistic superstition is bad, but it is even worse in the practical sphere as we are concerned with here. As it assumes that genius in the future must fall from the sky, it does not concern itself with those occult nonsense or fantastic mysticism that speak of preparation for inspiration. Thus, the superstition of materialists hinders the true progress of humanity. It does not safeguard the development of the faculties latent in humans. In fact, those who call themselves progressives and freethinkers are often the enemies of true progress. But this, as mentioned, is just a casual observation, necessary due to the relationship of occult science with current culture. Now, the powers of the soul that are stored in the inner being of the student through the renunciation of normal feelings, as indicated earlier, are treasures that would undoubtedly transform into inspirations, even if nothing else assisted them, and the occult student would experience how true images of thought emerge in their soul, representing experiences in higher worlds. Progress would begin with the simplest experiences of supersensible events, and slowly, other more complicated and elevated experiences would appear if the student continued to live inwardly according to the suggested directions. But in reality, such occult training would today be entirely impractical, and nowhere is it carried out with seriousness where the work is undertaken. For if the student wished to develop out of themselves everything that inspiration can give, they could undoubtedly weave out of themselves all that has been said here, for example about the nature of man, human life after death, the evolution of humanity and the planets, etc. But such a student would need a guide to teach them all that is available. However, such a student would need an inconceivably long time to do so. It would be, for example, as if a person were to weave all of geometry out of themselves without considering what has already been achieved in this realm before them. Certainly, in theory, it is totally possible. Putting it into practice would be madness. Moreover, this is not the procedure in occult science, but through a teacher, things that have been acquired by predecessors inspired for humanity are transmitted. This tradition must, for the moment, form the basis of individual inspiration. What is offered today in literature and in lectures outside the field of occult science can absolutely provide such a foundation for inspiration. For example, there are teachings on the various components of man, physical body, etheric body, astral body, etc., knowledge concerning life after death in preparation for a new incarnation, and everything that has been printed under the title Cosmic Memory. In other words, it must be sustained at all times that inspiration is necessary to discover and personally experience the higher truths, but not to understand them. What is communicated in the cosmic memory cannot be discovered initially without inspiration. But once communicated, it can be understood through completely ordinary logical judgment. No one should claim that things said there cannot be logically understood without inspiration. If such truths are received, they awaken inspiration in the soul by their own force. However, if one wishes to participate in such inspiration, one must make the effort not to receive this knowledge in a prosaic and practical way, but to open oneself to be moved by the rise of ideas toward all possible experiences of feeling. Why would this not be possible? Can the feeling remain dulled when overwhelming cosmic events pass before the gaze of the spirit? How the earth has developed from the moon, the sun, and Saturn, or when one penetrates into the infinite depths of human nature through knowledge of the etheric and astral bodies of man, etc. One could almost say, how lamentable for a person who can calmly contemplate such edifices of thought. For if they did not consider them prosaically but lived through all the tensions and relaxations of feeling that they make possible, all the climaxes and crises, all the progressions and regressions, all the catastrophes and dispersions, then indeed they would prepare in themselves the very substance for inspiration itself. Certainly, the life of feeling necessary in front of such communications from a higher world can only really unfold through exercises like those indicated above. Whoever turns all their feeling forces toward the external world of sensory perception will see the narratives of a higher world as dry concepts, as grey theory. They will never understand why another finds the communications of occult science moving while their own heart remains cold before them. They will even say, "But this is only for the intellect. This is intellectual. I want something for my entire well-being, But they do not say to themselves that it is their own fault if their heart remains cold. Many still underestimate the power of what is hidden in these communications from a higher world, and in this sense, they overvalue all kinds of other exercises and procedures. What good does it do me, they say, to learn from others about the higher worlds? I want to see them for myself. Such people mostly lack the patience to repeatedly focus on these narratives of higher worlds. If they did, they would see the power that these simple stories have, and how one's own inspiration is stimulated by hearing about the inspirations of others. Certainly, other exercises must complement mere learning if the student wishes to progress quickly in experiencing the higher worlds. But no one should underestimate the great importance of precisely the learning. In any case, it cannot be expected that the student will make rapid advances in the higher worlds through any exercise unless they also dedicate themselves to incessantly reflecting on the purely narrative communications that have been given to them from a competent source regarding the events and beings of the higher worlds. Now that such communications are indeed presented in literature, in lectures, etc., and that the first indications for the exercises leading to knowledge of the higher worlds are also given, such as, for example, the guidance presented in the knowledge of the higher worlds and its attainment, it has become possible to learn something of what was previously only communicated in strictly monitored occult schools. As has been mentioned often, it is due to the special conditions of our time that these things are and must be published. However, on the other hand, it must be emphasized once again that, although the acquisition of occult knowledge has thus been made easier, one cannot completely dispense with the secure guidance of an experienced occult teacher. Cognition through inspiration leads people to experience processes in the invisible worlds, such as the evolution of humanity, the Earth, and its planetary incarnations. But when in these higher worlds not only processes but also beings are considered, intuition must enter as a mode of cognition. What occurs through such beings is discerned through imagination in images, the laws and relationships through inspiration. If one wishes to encounter the beings themselves, intuition is needed. Later, it will be explained how inspiration is articulated in the world of imaginations, how it imbues them like a spiritual music, thus becoming the medium of expression for the beings that must be known through intuition. Then, intuition itself will also be discussed. Here, it must only be noted that what is called intuition in occult science has nothing to do with the application of the word intuition in common everyday usage. By this application, a vague or uncertain notion is meant, as opposed to clear cognition that is logically achieved through intellect or reason. In occult science, intuition is not vague and uncertain, but a high mode of cognition, filled with the clearest clarity and the most undoubted certainty. Chapter 4. Inspiration and Intuition. Just as imagination can be called a spiritual vision, inspiration can be called a spiritual hearing. Of course, it must be made very clear that with the expression hearing, an even more distant perception from sensory hearing in the physical world is meant much like seeing in the imaginative, astral world, is far removed from seeing with the physical eyes. One could say of the phenomena of light and color in the imaginative world that the radiant surfaces and colors of sensory objects are as if they were rising from these objects and floating freely in space. But this only gives an approximate idea, for the space in the imaginative world is in no way like that in the physical world. Whoever believes they have before them imaginative color images while seeing freely floating color particles in ordinary spatial dimension is mistaken. But the formation of such color representations is still the path to imaginative life. Anyone who tries to place a flower before the eye of their mind and then separates from its image all that does not represent color, so that an image of the colored surface detached from the flower is suspended before their soul, can gradually through such exercises come to imagination. This image itself is not yet such an imagination, but more or less a preliminary fanciful suggestion. Imagination, meaning the true astral experience, first exists when not only the color is completely separated from the sensory impression, but also when the three-dimensional space has been completely lost. That this is the case can only be confirmed by a certain sensation. This sensation is described by saying that one no longer feels outside, but inside the color image, and has the awareness of participating in its birth. If this feeling does not exist, if one remains before the object as before an image of color linked to the senses, then one is still not seeing true imagination but something of fantasy. It should not be said that such images of fantasy are entirely useless. In fact, they may be etheric reflections, like shadows, of real astral events. As such, they have their value in occult scientific training, only there is a certain danger in the observation if the observer does not fully apply their sound human judgment in this boundary between the sensible and the supersensible. It is not to be expected that an infallible test can be given to differentiate illusion, hallucination and fantasy from reality at this boundary. Such a general rule would certainly be convenient, but convenience is a word the occult student should eliminate from their vocabulary. It can only be said that whoever wishes to acquire clarity of discernment in this sphere must already be engaged in this, in the ordinary life of the physical world. Whoever does not take care to think sharply and clearly in ordinary life will be a victim of all possible illusions in their ascent to the higher worlds. One need only consider how many traps of daily life threaten sound judgment. How many times do people not see what exists without confusion, but what they long to see? How many cases of people believing something, not because they have discerned it, but because it is acceptable to believe it? Or how many errors arise because one does not go to the root of a thing, but forms a hasty judgment? All these deceptive motives in ordinary life could be multiplied indefinitely. How many traps are laid to sound judgment by partisan feelings, passions, etc.? If such errors of judgment in ordinary life are disturbing and often disastrous, they are the greatest conceivable danger to the integrity of supersensible experience. No general rule can be given to the student for their orientation in the higher worlds beyond the advice to do everything possible for their sound powers of discernment and their healthy and independent judgment. When the observer of the higher worlds knows what true imagination is, they soon acquire the conviction that images of the astral world are not mere images, but manifestations of spiritual beings. They come to know that these imaginative images refer to spiritual or soul beings, just as sensory colors refer to sensory things or beings. In particular, they will of course have much to learn. They must learn to distinguish between color formations that are opaque and those that are quite transparent, and in their inner nature, clear and radiant. In fact, they will perceive formations that seem to continuously produce their color light from within, and therefore are not only completely illuminated and transparent, but always radiating light from within. They will relate the opaque formations to lower beings, the clear and luminous ones to intermediate entities. The ones that are internally radiant will be for them manifestations of higher spiritual beings. If we want to reach the truth about the imaginative world, we must not form too narrow a concept of spiritual vision, for in that world there are not only perceptions of light and color, comparable to experiences of sight in the physical world, but also impressions of heat and cold, taste and smell, and even other experiences of the imaginative senses, for which the physical world offers no likeness. Impressions of heat and cold in the imaginative astral world are revelations of the will and intention of the spiritual and soul beings. The fact that a being aims for good or evil manifests itself in a concrete effect of heat or cold. Astral beings can also be tasted or smelled. Only what constitutes the physical element of tone and sound is almost entirely absent in the real imaginative world. In this respect, there is an absolute stillness. However, something very different, comparable to tone and sound, music and speech, appears for the advancing spiritual observer in the world of the senses. This higher element intervenes when all the tones and sounds of the physical world outside are completely silenced. In fact, when even the faintest interior echo of the soul from this sphere of the outer world is silenced. Then, for the observer, what could be called an understanding of the meaning of imaginative experiences takes place. If we had to compare what is now experienced to something from the physical world, we could only approximate the matter by referring to something that does not exist at all in that world. Suppose it is possible to perceive the thoughts and feelings of a human being without hearing their words with the physical ear. Such perception could be comparable to a direct understanding of the imaginative element called hearing in the spiritual sense. What speaks are the impressions of color and light, in the illuminations and attenuations, in the chromatic metamorphosis of the images, harmonies, and discords reveal the feelings, representations, and thought life of soul and spiritual beings. Just as tone becomes speech in the physical man when thought is impressed upon him, so the harmonies and discords of the spiritual world grow into manifestations that are defined thought entities. To this end, darkness must fall upon that world for thought to reveal itself in its immediacy. The experience here is, the bright color tones, red, yellow, and orange, are seen fading, and it is perceived how the higher world darkens through green to blue and violet. At the same time, an increase in the energy of inner will is experienced. One experiences complete freedom with respect to space and time. There is a feeling of being in motion. Certain forms and linear figures are experienced. They are not experienced as if they are drawn before one in any spatial extension, but rather as if in continuous movement. Each curve, each form is followed by the ego. In fact, the self feels both like the drafter and the drawing material. Every linear direction, every change of position, is simultaneously an experience of this self. The moving self recognizes itself as connected to the creative forces of the world. The laws of the world are no longer something that the ego perceives externally, but a truly miraculous fabric that it is helping to weave. When these correspond to the facts and are not mere invented figures, they are based on the experiences of the observer in the higher worlds, which must be considered as described above. Thus, the world of inspiration is situated within the imaginative world. When the imaginations begin to reveal their meanings to the observer in a silent speech, the world of inspiration arises within the imaginative world. From that world into which the spiritual observer thus penetrates, the physical is a manifestation. Everything in the physical world that is accessible to the senses and the intellect linked to the senses is only the outer side. To give just one example, the plant observed with the physical senses and the physical intellect is not the whole plant being. Whoever only knows this physical plant is like a being who might be able to perceive the fingernail of a human being, but for whom the perception of the human being itself would be inaccessible. But the structure and being of the fingernail can only be understood when explained by the entire nature of the human being. Similarly, the plant can only be understood when one knows what belongs to it, just as the whole nature of the human being relates to the human fingernail. But what is related to the plant cannot be found in the physical world. The plant is related to something fundamental that can only be revealed by imagination in the astral world, and moreover, to something that will only be revealed by inspiration in the spiritual world. From what precedes, it is evident how a path opens for the observer of the higher worlds that has its beginning in the physical world. That is, one can start from the physical world and from its manifestations ascend to the higher being that sustains them. If one starts from the animal kingdom, they can ascend through this to the imaginative world. If starting from the plant world, spiritual observation will lead them through imagination to the world of inspiration. If this path is taken, within the imaginative and inspirational worlds, beings and events will soon be encountered that are not revealed at all in the physical world. Therefore, one should not believe that in this way, only beings from the higher worlds with physical manifestations are known. Whoever has once entered the imaginative world comes to know a multitude of beings and events of which the observer of the merely physical world has no inkling. Now, there is another path. It does not start from the physical world. It directly makes a person clairvoyant in the higher regions of existence. For many people, this method may have more attraction than the one indicated above. But for our life conditions, only the ascent from the physical world should be chosen. It demands from the observer the self-renunciation necessary if they want, first of all, to examine the physical world around them, accumulate knowledge and, above all, experience. In any case, it is the method that best suits our current cultural conditions. The other path presupposes the prior acquisition of qualities of the soul that are extremely difficult to attain in modern life conditions. Although such soul qualities have been emphasized again and again with total clarity and precision in previous writings, most people have no idea, or at most an inadequate idea, of the extent to which these qualities, for example selflessness and devoted love, must be acquired in order to reach the higher worlds without starting from the firm ground of the physical. If someone were to wake up in the higher worlds without having reached the required degree of the corresponding soul qualities, the result would be an indescribable misery. However, one should not believe that these previously described soul qualities can be dispensed with if one starts from the physical world and its experiences. Believing this would also be a mistake of serious consequences, but such a beginning allows for the gradual acquisition of these qualities to the extent, and especially in the form, possible in our current life conditions. In this regard, another point must be considered. If the beginning is made in the manner indicated from the physical world, a living connection with this physical world is preserved despite the ascent to higher worlds. Full understanding of everything that happens in it continues, and full energy to work within it. In fact, this understanding and energy increase in a very useful way only through knowledge of the higher worlds. In all areas of life, even in what seems most prosaically practical, the knower of the higher worlds will work better and more usefully than the non-knower, provided they have maintained a living connection with the physical world. But whoever wakes up in the higher spheres of existence without starting from the physical world drifts too easily away from life. They become a hermit, facing their contemporaries without understanding or sympathy. In fact, it even happens that people with incomplete development in this regard, not of course those with perfect development, look with some disdain at the experiences of the physical world and feel superior, and so on. Instead of increasing their sympathy toward the world, such people become hardened and selfish in the spiritual sense. The temptation in all of this is truly not light, and those who strive to ascend to the higher worlds would do well to pay attention to it. From inspiration, the spiritual observer can reach intuition. In the language of occult science, this word denotes in many ways exactly the opposite of what it is often used for in ordinary life. In the ordinary sense, intuition is spoken of when one has a faintly felt notion of something that seems true, but still lacks a clear conceptual definition. It is more a precursor to knowledge than knowledge itself. An idea of this nature can, according to that definition, illuminate a great truth like a flash of lightning. But it only becomes valuable as knowledge when it is grounded in conceptual judgment. Sometimes intuition also refers to something felt, which one is fully convinced of, but has not been weighed with intellectual judgment. People who become familiar with spiritual scientific knowledge often say, "That has always been clear to me intuitively." All of this must be entirely set aside if the term intuition is to be maintained in its true meaning as understood here. In this context, intuition is not a mode of cognition that, in terms of clarity, follows behind intellectual knowledge but rather far exceeds it. In inspiration, the experiences of the higher worlds speak their meaning. The observer lives in the qualities and actions of the beings of these higher worlds. If, as described earlier, the observer follows a linear direction or the shape of a figure with their self, they know they are not within the being itself, but within its qualities and functions. Even in imaginative cognition, they have experienced the sensation of not being outside, but inside the color images. But they are no less clearly aware that these color images are not independent beings in themselves, but the qualities of such beings. In inspiration, they are aware that they become one with the acts of such beings, with the manifestations of their will. In intuition, for the first time, they merge their own self with that of autonomous beings. This can only occur correctly if the emergence takes place not by fading away, but by fully maintaining one's own being. Any loss of self in another being is bad. Therefore, only a self strongly fortified within itself can immerse itself without harm in another being. One has truly grasped something intuitively if the feeling arises that in it expresses a being of the same nature and inner content as the self. Whoever examines a stone with their external senses and tries to understand its peculiarities with their intellect, and through usual scientific resources, comes to know only the external aspect of the stone. As a spiritual observer, they proceed to imaginative and inspired knowledge. By dwelling within inspiration, they can come to an additional feeling. This can be characterized as follows through a comparison. Suppose one sees a man in the street. At first, they make a fleeting impression on the observer. Later, one becomes more familiar with him. Then comes the moment when they become such a friend that the soul opens to the soul. The experience through which one passes when the veils of the soul fall away and one ego faces another is comparable to that in which, for the spiritual observer, the stone appears only as an external manifestation, and they move towards something related to the stone, like the nail to the human body, and experience themselves as an ego, just like their own ego. That type of knowledge that leads to the innermost nature of beings is first attained by man in intuition. When speaking of inspiration, the transformation that the spiritual observer's inner soul constitution must undergo to reach this mode of knowledge has been mentioned. In this regard, it has been said that, for example, a wrong conclusion must extend its effects not only to the intellect, but to the sensitive nature, which must cause sorrow and pain, and the observer must systematically cultivate such an inner experience. Of course, as long as this pain arises from the sympathies and antipathies of the ego and from biased attitudes, the preparation for inspiration cannot be considered adequate. Such involvement of the soul is far from the inner sympathy that the ego must feel for pure truth, as truth, if it wants to reach the proclaimed goal. It cannot be emphasized enough that all forms of interest that prevail in ordinary life, such as pleasure and pain in relation to truth and error, must first be silenced, and then a completely different type of interest must enter, one entirely free of egoism, if one wants to make progress in cognition through inspiration. However, this quality of the inner life of the soul is only a means of preparation for inspiration. There are an unlimited number of other qualities that must be added to it, and the more the spiritual observer refines what has already served them for inspiration, the better equipped they will be to approach intuition.